The sound is unmistakable. It is not merely a noise, it is a physical sensation, a resonant frequency that seems to vibrate in the marrow of your bones before the source is even visible against the blue canvas of the sky. It begins as a low, throaty growl, a distant thunder rolling over the horizon, and then it sharpens, pitching up into a terrifying, beautiful scream. It is the song of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, V12, liquid-cooled, 16 and 50 horses of refined violence wrapped in North American aluminum. For a generation of young men in the mid-1940s, this was the sound of salvation. It was the sound of the P-51 Mustang. We know the legend. We know the story of how it broke the back of the Luftwaffe, how it escorted the B-17 second deep into the heart of the Reich, how it gave the Allies the keys to the roof of Europe. We celebrate the victories, the aces, the gun camera footage showing Focke-Wulfs disintegrating in a hail of 50 caliber fire. But when the ticker tape fell on 5E Day and the mushroom clouds dissipated over Japan, the world didn't just stop. The gears of history kept grinding, and the machines that built the peace were suddenly, violently unemployed. What happens to a gladiator when the Colosseum closes? What happens to the sword when the war is won? The story of the P-51 Mustang did not end in 1945. In fact, its most complex, tragic, and bizarre chapters were just beginning. This is the story of the afterlife of the Cadillac of the skies. Imagine the scene in late 1945. The sheer scale of American industrial might is difficult to comprehend today. We had built thousands upon thousands of these fighters. They were rolling off assembly lines in Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas, with a rhythmic precision that terrified our enemies. And then, abruptly, the telegrams stopped coming. The contracts were canceled. The war was over. For the pilots, there was the relief of survival, the train ride home, the reunions on front porches. But for the airplanes, they were massed on tarmacs, wingtip to wingtip, stretching for miles. In the blink of an eye, the P-51 went from being the most advanced, sought-after tactical weapon on the planet to surplus inventory. Obsolescence wasn't creeping up on the Mustang. It was sprinting toward it in the form of the jet engine. The Germans had shown us the Me-262. The British had the Meteor. We had the P-80 Shooting Star. The era of the propeller was dying, and the Mustang was the magnificent king of a dying kingdom. The immediate fate of thousands of these thoroughbreds is one of the most heartbreaking images in aviation history. If you drive out to Kingman, Arizona, or Walnut Ridge, Arkansas, today you see desert scrub and empty concrete. But in 1946 and 1947, these places were aluminum graveyards. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation had the job of disposing of the surplus. They didn't see history, they saw scrap metal. They saw high-grade aluminum that could be melted down to build toasters, mobile homes, and pots and pans for the booming post-war suburbs. The P-51 seconds were flown in by ferry pilots who hopped out, threw the keys on the seat, and walked away. The planes were lined up in the scorching sun. Then came the guillotine, a massive, crude blade dropped from a crane that chopped the tails off the fuselage and sliced the wings. It was a butchery. Engines that had been meticulously tuned by master mechanics were ripped out and tossed into piles. Canopies that had shielded young men from the freezing stratospheric winds were crushed. At Kingman alone, nearly 5,000 aircraft were destroyed. A P-51 that cost the government over $50,000 to build, a fortune in the 1940s, was sold for scrap for pennies a pound. But amidst this industrial slaughter, there were survivors. And this is where the story shifts from tragedy to a strange, almost reckless freedom. The War Assets Administration put a price tag on the flyable Mustangs that escaped. The chopper. For a brief, surreal window in American history, you could walk onto a lot and buy a full, functional, combat-ready P-51 Mustang for roughly $3,000. Some went for as little as $1,500. To put that in perspective, that was the price of a decent new car. Imagine walking into a dealership today and buying an F-22 Raptor for the price of a Ford Taurus. It was insanity, and it attracted a specific breed of buyer. It wasn't the dentist or the accountant buying these. It was the adrenaline junkies, the oilmen, the barnstormers, and the ex-military pilots who couldn't adjust to the quiet life. They bought them stripped out the armor plating, ripped out the heavy radios and the guns, and turned them into personal hot rods. The skies over America in the late 40s were wild. There were no complex air traffic control networks like we have today. You had guys firing up Merlins in their backyards, blasting over cornfields at 400 miles an hour, chasing the ghost of the war they had just left. The national air races started up again, and the Mustang became the star of the show. The Bendix Trophy, the Thompson Trophy, these became the proving grounds for modified Mustangs. They clipped the wings to reduce drag. They injected water methanol mixtures into the manifolds to boost the horsepower to dangerous levels. They pushed the airframes until rivets popped and coolant lines burst. It was dangerous. It was loud. And it kept the spirit of the Mustang alive, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of raw, unadulterated speed. While the civilians were playing with their new toys, the United States Air Force, newly formed in 1947, was trying to forget the Mustang. They were obsessed with the jet age. The P-51 was redesignated the F-51, F for fighter, but it was relegated to the Air National Guard. It was a weekend warriors plane now, something for the reserves to fly wide. The active duty boys played with the F-80s and F-84s. The brass thought the propeller was done. They thought dogfighting was a thing of the past. They believed the next war would be fought with missiles and supersonic interceptors at 40,000 feet. They were wrong. History has a nasty habit of proving the strategists wrong, and the correction came on a rainy Sunday morning in June 1950. The North Korean People's Army surged across the 38th parallel. They had Soviet-built T-34 tanks, and they were rolling south with terrifying speed. The United States was caught flat-footed. We had jets in Japan, the F-80 Shooting Stars, but there was a problem. The F-80 was a fuel hog. It could fly from Japan to Korea, but it could only loiter over the battlefield for a few minutes before it had to turn back. It was too fast to see the camouflage tanks hiding in the mud and the trees. It was a sprinter trying to run a marathon. The call went out. Where are the Mustangs? The Air Force frantically began recalling the F-51s from the National Guard units. They even went to the scrapyards to see what could be salvaged. They pulled pilots out of desk jobs, men who hadn't flown in 5 years. The Mustang was going back to war, but this was not the war it was built for. In World War II, the Mustang was a high-altitude escort. It lived at 25,000 feet in the thin, cold airway. Its laminar flow wing and two-stage supercharger gave it supremacy. In Korea, there were no enemy bombers to intercept. There was no Luftwaffe. The mission was close air support, mud moving, truck busting. The Mustang was forced down from the heavens into the grime of the valleys. It was tasked with carrying napalm canisters and 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, VARs. It was asked to fly at treetop level, strafing columns of infantry and blowing up bridges. This transition was brutal. The Mustang was a fragile bird in this environment. Its liquid-cooled engine was its Achilles heel. The Merlin engine relied on a complex system of radiators and coolant lines. A single bullet, even a lowly rifle round from a peasant soldier on a hill, could pierce a radiator line. Once the coolant leaked out, the engine would seize up in minutes. The pilot had to bail out or crash land, often in enemy territory. And Korea was not France. The terrain was rugged, mountainous, and unforgiving. The treatment of prisoners was horrific. Pilots knew that if the engine quit, their chances of survival were slim. Yet, they flew. They flew until the wings were black with soot. They flew until the barrels of their 50 cals were burned out. The F-51 became the workhorse of the early Korean War. It could loiter for hours. It could carry a heavy payload. It could turn inside the valleys where the jets would smash into the granite walls. The pilots developed a dark affection for the old girl. They cursed the heat in the cockpit. The Mustang didn't have air conditioning and at low altitudes in the Korean summer, it was a sauna, but they loved the firepower. Major Louis Sabille, a Mustang pilot, became the first flyer in the new Air Force to receive the Medal of Honor posthumously. He was flying a damaged F-51, loaded with bombs, and rather than bail out, he dove his plane directly into an enemy convoy that was threatening American troops. That was the spirit of the Mustang in Korea. It wasn't glorious. It was gritty. It was a desperate stopgap measure that saved thousands of GA lives on the ground. Eventually, the jets caught up. The F-86 Sabre arrived to tangle with the MiG-15 seconds, and the F-51 was slowly phased out of U.S. service. By the end of the Korean conflict, the Mustang's days as an American combat aircraft were effectively over. But the world is a big place, and the hunger for cheap, effective air power was insatiable. As the U.S. retired them, the Mustang began its third life, the mercenary. The United States government began selling and gifting F-51s to allies around the globe. It became the primary fighter for nations in Latin America, the Caribbean, Asia, and the Middle East. It flew for the Chinese nationalists in Taiwan. It flew for the South Koreans. It flew for the Philippine Air Force. It found a home in the mountains of Switzerland, where the Swiss Air Force kept them. In pristine condition, hidden in cavernous underground hangars carved into the Alps, the Swiss loved the Mustang for its ability to navigate the narrow alpine valleys. Perhaps the most dramatic chapter of the Mustang's foreign service occurred in the Middle East. When the state of Israel was fighting for its existence in 1948, they scrambled to acquire any aircraft they could find. Agents for the Haganah scoured the globe, buying Mustangs through shell companies and smuggling them into Israel. In the War of Independence and the 1956 Sinai Campaign, Israeli pilots, some of them veterans of the RAF and USAF, flew Mustangs against Egyptian Spitfires. It was a bizarre historical encore, a rematch of the two greatest Allied fighters of World War II, now fighting each other over the sands of the Sinai. The Israelis modified them, pushed them, and used them to cut supply lines. The Mustang, designed to defeat Nazis, was now securing the future of the Jewish state. But the Mustang's strangest combat legacy belongs to Central America, specifically to the year 1969. It sounds like fiction, but it is historical fact. The last piston-engine dogfight in history was fought between P-51 Mustangs and Vought F-4U Corsairs. It happened during the so-called soccer war between El Salvador and Honduras. Tensions over land reform and immigration had been simmering for years, and they boiled over during a series of World Cup qualifying matches. When the shooting started, both nations deployed their air forces, which were essentially flying museums of World War II surplus. El Salvador flew Mustangs, Honduras flew Corsairs. On July 17, 1969, Captain Fernando Soto of the Honduran Air Force, flying a Corsair, engaged Salvadoran Mustangs. In a twisting, turning, low-level dogfight that would have looked familiar to a pilot from 1945, Soto shot down 3 Salvadoran aircraft, including 2 Mustangs. It was the final curtain call for the piston-engine fighter in air-to-air combat. The era that began with the Red Baron over the trenches of France ended over the jungles of Central America. Half a century later, while the Mustang was fighting these bush wars back in the United States, a different kind of preservation was taking root. By the 1960s and 70s, the P-51 had moved from the scrapyard list to the endangered species list. The warbird movement was born. Men who had grown up building models of the Mustang, or who had heard their fathers talk about them, began to seek out the remaining airframes. The price began to climb. That $1,500 surplus plane was now worth $50,000, then $100,000. Today, a pristine, combat veteran P-51 can command prices north of $2 or $3 million. But it wasn't just about the money, it was about the ghosts. Restoration shops popped up, dedicated to returning these machines to their factory-fresh glory. They weren't just fixing engines, they were archaeologists. They would strip paint off a fuselage and find the original nose art underneath. A faded pinup girl, a nickname like Old Crow or Glamorous Glen. They found bullet hole patches from 1944. They found cigarette butts tucked into the crevices of the cockpit. Every dent told a story. One of the most poignant aspects of the Mustang's post-war life is the reunions. Picture an air show in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, in the 1990s. A restored P-51 taxis to the ramp, the propeller chopping the air, the engine popping and growling. The canopy slides back. The pilot, a wealthy collector in his 40s, helps an old man up onto the wing. The old man is in his 80s now, frail, leaning on a cane. He wears a faded ball cap with the emblem of the 357th Fighter Group. He trembles as he looks into the cockpit. He reaches out a wrinkled hand and touches the throttle quadrant. The the grip of the control stick. And for a moment, the years melt away. He isn't an old man in a nursing home anymore. He is 22 years old, the master of the sky, escorting the big friends to Berlin. The smell of the oil, the 100-octane fuel, the leather it triggers a visceral memory that time cannot erase. Tears stream down his face. The current owner stands back, silent, respecting the sacred communion between the warrior and his steed. This scene has played out hundreds of times across America. The P-51 became a bridge between generations, a tangible, roaring connection to the greatest generation. The Mustang also evolved into a canvas for civilian innovation. At the Reno Air Races, the unlimited class is dominated by highly modified Mustangs. These are not the stock fighters of 1945. These are monsters, the Striga, the Voodoo, the Dago Red. They have clipped wings, boil-off cooling systems, and Merlin engine, tuned to produce 3,000 horsepower, double the wartime rating. They race around pylons at 500 miles per hour, 50 feet off the ground. It is the most dangerous motorsport in the world. Pilots risk their lives pushing the 50-year-old aluminum to the breaking point. Critics say it desecrates history, that these rare artifacts should be in museums, preserved under glass. But the racers argue that the Mustang was built for speed, built for violence, built to be pushed. To put it in a museum is to kill it. To race it is to keep its heart beating. We must also acknowledge the tragedy that follows the Mustang even in peace. Because it is a high-performance machine, it is unforgiving of error. Many wealthy amateurs bought Mustangs, thinking they could fly them like a Cessna that couldn't. The torque of the Merlin engine on takeoff is tremendous if you jam the throttle. Forward too fast, the plane will torque roll right into the ground. It has happened time and time again. The Widowmaker reputation resurfaced. It demands respect. It demands a pilot who understands energy management, who understands the gyroscopic precession of that massive propeller. We lost good pilots and rare airframes to hubris, but we also saw the rise of dedicated flight schools, like the ones run by Lee Lauterbach, teaching the art of flying the Mustang safely, ensuring that the skills didn't die out with the veterans. Today, roughly 150 P-51 Mustangs are still airworthy worldwide. That is a tiny fraction of the more than 15,000 that were built. But their impact is disproportionate to their numbers. When a Mustang flies over a stadium during the national anthem, the crowd goes silent. You can feel the history. You can feel the weight of what that silhouette represents. It represents the destruction of fascism. It represents the industrial capability of a free people. It represents the lost boys who never came back from the missions over the Rhine. The P-51 Mustang did not just disappear into the history books after 1945. It struggled, it adapted, it fought in new wars, it raced, it crashed, and it was reborn. It transitioned from a weapon of war to an icon of peace. Consider the engineering marvel of the cooling scoop on the underside of the fuselage. That distinct belly. That was the secret weapon, the Meredith effect. The engineers figured out that by ducting the air through the radiator in a specific way, they could actually generate a small amount of thrust from the heated air, exiting the back. It canceled out the drag of the radiator. It was genius, and that genius is still flying. When you look at a P-51 today, you aren't looking at a relic. You are looking at a machine that has lived 1,000 lives. It has seen the curvature of the earth from 30,000 feet over Germany. It has seen the terrified faces of North Korean troops in the mud. It has seen the desperate jungle warfare of Central America. It has seen the golden pylons of Reno. It has seen the tears of the men who flew it. The story of the P-51 after World War II is the story of survival. It is the story of how we value our history. Do we melt it down for quick cash? Do we use it until it breaks? Or do we cherish it? The Mustang forced us to answer those questions. It forced us to recognize that some machines have a soul. As we move further into the 21st century, the roar of the Merlin engine becomes rarer. The pilots who flew them in anger are almost all gone. Soon, there will be no one left who remembers seeing them swarm the skies in the hundreds. But the planes remain. They are the guardians of the memory. As long as there is 100-octane fuel and a mechanic with a wrench and a love for history, the P-51 will not die. It will continue to scream its defiance against gravity, a silver ghost haunting the modern sky, reminding us of where we came from and the price that was paid to get us here. The propeller spins, a blur of motion, biting the air, pulling the past into the present. The chocks are pulled. The throttle moves forward. The tail comes up. And the Mustang flies on immortal,